Formula One returns to our lives with the Azerbaijan Grand Prix, which is set to be held this weekend. And well, we're pretty excited because this season so far has shaped up to be very, very interesting. And one of the reasons that it has been interesting, well, as I guess you can see from the graphic on my screen, is the fact that the title hunt is potentially right now a three-way. So obviously, Azerbaijan street circuit, very interesting in its own right. There's some tight corners. There's a long straight towards the end of that starts this third sector, as well as the beginning of the first sector. Interesting track, but ahead of what should be a very interesting race, and which in 2021 served up an absolute classic. We are going to look at 5 major talking points from what we can expect to look forward to in this race. And the first talking point is, of course, the Red Bulls. Now, last year when Max Verstappen was challenging Lewis Hamilton for the title, two-way shootout, you knew full well that Red Bull were always going to favor Verstappen when it came down to crunch situations, and they would ask Perez potentially to either play for the team or move over in case necessary. This time around, however, the equation is just that little bit different. Perez is now suddenly in title contention thanks to a couple of good results, particularly his win in Monaco, where he drove quite well considering the circumstances and managed to hold off not just his own teammate but also the Ferraris. So massive result for Perez, and suddenly Perez, who was also announced as a Red Bull driver for the next 2 seasons after this, is suddenly in title contention. And for Red Bull, that is an interesting problem to have, because as I said, last year it was all about making Max win. But right now, if Perez can get a couple of good results and put himself ahead of Verstappen, then Red Bull have quite the conundrum on their hands. Publicly, team principal Christian Horner has said that, look, we don't care which of our drivers wins it. We want the focus to be on the Constructors' Championship, and if either of our drivers win the World Drivers' Championship, it's good for Red Bull. But that is something that will be put to the test if indeed it comes down to that, because as we know, Verstappen has been something of a project for Red Bull ever since he was with the team in 2016 onwards. So he has been the golden boy, and he is, of course, the defending world champion as well. Will Red Bull actually favor Perez if it really comes down to it? I guess we'll see, but it is something worth keeping an eye on, especially since Perez not only has a better grip of the 2022 Red Bull, he's also upped his game in qualifying. So the one thing which Max really had over him, which was his performances in qualifying, Perez is now at least matching or keeping the gap to a bare minimum. But of course, the title race is not just between the Red Bulls. There's also this man, Charles Leclerc of Ferrari, who started the season in scintillating form but has struggled in recent races, sometimes his own making, sometimes down to the team making some very poor calls. Now obviously, which is Ferrari's car for the 2022 season, is a very, very fast car, and for the most part has been a reliable car. The only time they really faced an issue was in Spain when Leclerc, who was comfortably leading the race, had to retire. But since then, there have been questions over Ferrari's strategy, particularly in Monaco, where, as we remember, Leclerc at pole position, but due to some ill-timed pit stops from Ferrari, some very well-judged pit stops from Red Bull, he ended up not only losing out on what should have been a first win in front of his home crowd, he didn't even make it on the podium. And as things stand, he's no longer in the lead in the World Drivers' Championship race, but he has done pretty well in the free practice sessions that have been held so far. So he would definitely be hopeful that maybe, just maybe, they can turn things around. Of course, if you ask me, I don't think Leclerc's driving has been the problem as much as it has been Ferrari's strategies. So whether or not they get this right could determine whether Baku is the weekend to remember or one to forget for the Scuderia. And of course, there is, as we know, this is not just the only talking point and not just the only major team. Questions have to be asked about what exactly is happening at Mercedes. I mean, we all saw that they had a very strong showing in Spain, where they seem to have finally put their porpoising issues behind them. However, in Monaco, which is known to be a somewhat bumpy track, the car was back to bouncing. Now, obviously, Mercedes team officials have said that the bouncing which we saw in Monaco was not actually porpoising. They have that issue under control. But it is down to other issues in the car. One of the issues which people have speculated is that the Mercedes in general is a slightly stiffer car, so it does tend to trigger bouncing, which is not porpoising, because porpoising, the kind of bouncing that comes from porpoising comes from the dropping and releasing of aerodynamic load. That's not really a problem, but the simple fact is the car's still bouncing, and they clearly have other issues to solve beyond just the porpoising issue. Now that they've got the porpoising in control, the focus will of course be on how they can get the most out of what is quite clearly a difficult car to drive, as well as extract full potential from. One of the major problems is that when it comes to race day, the Mercedes is quite clearly the third fastest car on the grid, but in qualifying they don't seem to find that sweet spot in terms of setup to get the best out of the car in a single lap. Something that George Russell himself said, that we often find ourselves stuck behind, whether it be an Alpine, whether it be a McLaren, in the race, before the race, and that tends to make things harder for us in the race. So far their practice session timings have not been very encouraging. They're still firmly mired in the midfield and still will most likely be only the third best car. Whether or not there's anything they can do, any setup changes, any sort of trickeries, strategies that they can come up with ahead of the race to actually put themselves in a better position, well, that's something we'll see soon enough. But it's not just about the big teams, it's also about, of course, smaller teams who've had done well. And one of the players who has done well in the practice sessions is, of course, AlphaTauri's Pierre Gasly. Gasly has, by his own standards, had quite the ordinary start to 2022 after a stellar 2021, but he seemed to be up and at his best. He was getting the car to have some good pace, but the midfield is once again packed, because it's not just Gasly who's done well. There's also been Fernando Alonso, who, as we know, finished fourth in the second practice. Now, fourth is no mean feat, considering Alpine were quite clearly only the fifth fastest car in the grid, and even now can be arguably said to be the fifth fastest car on the grid. So the fact that he's putting the car into fourth means they found something a little extra. But of course, don't forget, there's also Lando Norris and McLaren to contend for. So which of the midfield teams is actually going to have a good show? Well, that remains to be seen. But Gasly, remember, why I've pointed him out as a potential talking point is because he knows that his future in F1 is not very certain. His contract with AlphaTauri expires at the end of 2022. He thought that he might get the Red Bull seat back for 2023, but that's not happening because Perez has been signed on for 2 more years. So quite clearly he's putting on his best, because potentially the next few races could be an audition as to where exactly he ends up. Does he stick it out with AlphaTauri? Does he try his luck in some other team? We don't really know yet, but of course the best thing that he can do is drive and drive hard, and that's what he's done. But as I've said, that midfield competition is stiff. I didn't even mention the Alfa Romeos and of course the Haas team, but I didn't mention them for 2 reasons. Alfa Romeo have been a little up and down, and for Haas, the major problem has been what will be my 5th and final talking point, Mick Schumacher. Now, as we know, Mick Schumacher has had a pretty poor 2022. In 2021, he quite clearly outpaced his teammate Nikita Mazepin, but since Mazepin got dropped before the season and the team re-signed Kevin Magnussen in a 2-year deal, Magnussen has proved that Schumacher still has quite some ways to go before he can be considered up there with the best of Formula 1 drivers. To make matters worse, Schumacher has had a couple of expensive shunts so far this year. He crashed heavily in Saudi Arabia in the Jeddah Corniche circuit, and he also suffered a very heavy crash in the last race in Monaco. Now, the thing to note with both of those is not only was it just about finding that sweet spot or finding the limit and then him crossing the limit, both the places where he suffered heavy shunts were also street circuits. Baku, as you would know, is also a street circuit, and therefore there would be all eyes on the son of the legendary 7-time world champion Michael Schumacher to see whether or not A, he can avoid getting an accident, and B, whether he can actually put that or extract the most out of what is a pretty decent car. I mean, Kevin Magnussen has done pretty well with the limited chances that he's had so far. Remember, Magnussen barely had any time to drive the car in preseason as well, yet he's already managed a season best 5th place finish to this point. Schumacher, on the other hand, yet to score a point, and the pressure is on, because remember, he only has a contract at the end of this year. He would want that he can actually end up getting a further extended run in F1. He's not exactly a mug, it has to be put out there. He is, of course, someone who's won championships at the junior level, but so far he's struggled to show his best in what is a pretty good competitive Haas. So that's going to be the final talking point from my side. Do you think there's more things that we need to be watching out for in the Azerbaijan Grand Prix, whether it be qualifying or the race day? Let me know in the comments, and thank you all so much for joining us. If you enjoy what it is that we do, don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends, drop us some or as many comments as you want. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. We are on every single day covering the best from the world of sport, not just cricket, from sports around the world. We have so much more coming for you guys, and I hope you're along with us at all times. Thank you again for joining us. Don't forget to follow us across social media. We're on not just on YouTube, we're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram as well. As always, I've been Shane Dias, and I'll see you guys very, very soon.